Hola, muy buenas. Bienvenidos al programa Energía al Máximo. La industria europea tras varias tormentas en el mercado energético. ¿Cómo se encuentra la demanda industrial tras la crisis de gas? Hacemos estas preguntas a la experta de la Agencia de Inteligencia de Mercados, Argus. La inflación y los intentos de reducir las emisiones en el camino de la transición energética. Veremos la evaluación de posibles impactos en algunas de las industrias intensivas en energía. La siderurgia, una de las industrias estratégicas para Europa. ¿Cómo respira con estos cambios en el contexto energético y planes de descarbonización? Veremos este ejemplo del sector industrial en más detalles con el representante de la Asociación Europea de Acero, Eurofer. La estrategia industrial de la Unión Europea se encuentra en un periodo complejo, especialmente porque la industria de la Unión Europea se ve muy afectada por varias crisis convergentes de los últimos años. La crisis energética lleva al aumento de costes y socava el poder industrial de Europa a escala internacional. El sector industrial ha representado tradicionalmente en torno al 25% de la demanda total de gas de la Unión Europea. Los desafíos al sistema energético europeo son estructurales y el cambio en el suministro de gas que hemos tenido el año pasado, de los históricos suministros por gasoductos a importaciones más costosas de gas natural licuado, pone de relieve nuevas circunstancias que impactan en los precios y flujos de gas en Europa. Además, Europa ha marcado el desafío climático de reducir en torno al 55% de las emisiones de CO2 para el 2030. Así, la industria necesita encontrar nuevas soluciones en los próximos años, tanto para torear el panorama energético actual como para emprender nuevos planes de reducción de emisiones y desarrollo de nuevas tecnologías renovables. En este entorno, ¿cuáles son las condiciones energéticas que marcan el futuro para algunas de las industrias más importantes de Europa? ¿Cómo se proyecta el desarrollo industrial en los próximos años? ¿Vamos a recordar la crisis energética en Europa como catalizador de una transformación? ¿O vamos a lamentar que hemos dejado pasar esta oportunidad? Estas respuestas, que tienen enormes implicaciones para la economía industrial de Europa, está empezando a articularse ahora, pero darán sus frutos en los próximos meses. Vamos a hablar hoy de este tema con nuestros expertos. La electricidad y el gas representan 2/3 del consumo de la energía final en el sector industrial de la Unión Europea. Como hemos visto en uno de nuestros programas anteriores, Europa sobrevivió en el invierno pasado, sin apagones, a pesar de un corte récord en el suministro de gas por gasoductos de su exportador principal, Rusia. El año pasado, la Unión Europea redujo su consumo de gas en un 14%, la reducción de la demanda de gas más pronunciada de su historia. La demanda en el sector industrial en el 2022 cayó en torno al 25%, según los datos de la Agencia Internacional de Energía. Y no se puede pasar por alto paradas de producción en varios sectores industriales, y la industria especialmente intensiva en la energía ha reducido su consumo, como por ejemplo la química, la industria de los metales básicos y minerales no metálicos. Y a pesar de la caída de los precios de referencia de gas, el consumo el año pasado no se recuperaba. Nos gustaría ver con más detalle qué ocurre con la demanda industrial. ¿Se está recuperando o no? Estas preguntas haremos hoy a nuestra invitada, experto de la agencia Argus, que es líder de inteligencia en los mercados mundiales de energía.
Well, I will switch now to English to present you our guest, the expert from Argus Agency, Natasha Fielding. Argus is the leading independent provider of market intelligence on the global energy and commodity markets. Argus Daily European Natural Gas Service features key indexes for Europe's gas trading hubs with information about trading activity and analysis of market dynamics. And it's my pleasure to present you Natasha Fielding, the editor of Argus. She has been editor in this agency daily European natural gas publication for over 3 years and has been covering the gas market at Argus for over 7 years. Hello, Natasha.
Hi there.
So my first question is, how is the industrial demand recovery in Europe after the gas crisis of previous winter?
So we have seen a modest recovery in industrial gas demand in Europe this winter compared with the last one. And this is really down to much lower wholesale energy prices. So in particular, in Europe, the price of gas for delivery a month in advance at the benchmark TTF hub is at just 9% of where it was in the very height of the price spike in 2022. This reduction in gas prices has spurred an increase in industrial gas demand in Europe. However, it must be emphasized that gas demand in industry really lags well behind the pre-2022 average. And this is really down to for two reasons. Firstly, while European gas prices are much lower than where they were, they are still high relative to historical ranges, and they are still high relative to energy costs in competing markets like the US. And secondly, a weak economic environment really caps the potential for a further recovery in industrial gas demand at the moment.
And Natasha, this recovery or this slow recovery, in what energy-intensive industries the gas demand has been mostly affected?
So there really hasn't been a gas-intensive sector that wasn't affected in some way by the spike in European gas prices. But if I had to highlight one or two sectors in which gas use has been particularly low, it would be the chemical sector and the steel sector. And actually in these sectors, we are still seeing very weak demand compared with before 2022. And that's really because of a weak economic environment. We have a cost of living crisis across Europe. So even as gas prices are coming down, running costs for those factories are lower. Weak downstream consumer demand means that there has been very little recovery in industrial gas demand in those sectors particularly.
With you, one of the opinions in the market, the chief executive of Vitol, the world's top energy trader, said at one of the energy events that the lost demand for gas in Europe following this spike in prices may be gone for good. And we can expect some of that lost demand to stay lost forever. Do you share this opinion?
Yes, I mean, for me, it's not a question of whether some gas demand has been permanently lost, but really how much. A number of industrial companies, including the German chemicals giant BASF, have announced that they will permanently close some of their most gas-intensive plants. They plan to relocate their production elsewhere where there are lower energy costs. And some companies have accelerated energy efficiency measures. They've switched permanently to other fuels. So for sure, we can't expect industrial gas demand in Europe to jump back to where it was before 2022. However, we would still expect more gas demand to come back. So it's really a question of how much of that demand is permanently lost.
Well, while we're expecting this recovery in industrial demand from Argus, could you please share with us what is the midterm outlook of gas prices in this volatile current market, and also what outlook can we expect probably in summer or along this year?
So European gas prices have actually really steadily fallen for most of this winter, including last month when there was a cold spell throughout most of the region. So not just for shorter dated contracts, but also the companies are trading gas for several years in advance at a much lower level than this time last year. And for this reason, with gas contracts trading much lower for longer periods, companies, industrial companies, will have some more certainty about a lower price environment to potentially ramp up their operations. And this summer, actually, Europe looks well supplied. It's really down to high underground gas storage inventories. So, unless the summer is really hot, which would spur cooling demand, we would expect gas demand in Europe to stay quite weak this summer. However, going forward, we expect volatility in prices, a day-on-day swings in prices, to be higher than they were before the 2022 crisis period. There's so much more uncertainty in Europe's gas market now than there used to be. Russian gas used to make up a large share of Europe's supply. It was guaranteed to European customers under long-term contracts. Europe's gas market now is much more reliant on LNG, liquefied natural gas, and therefore it is exposed to the volatility on the global LNG markets. European companies have to compete with Asian firms for those LNG cargoes. And for this reason, volatility in prices and potential for price rises remains high for the coming years.
Natasha, thank you very much for sharing with us your outlook. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bueno, esto fue con nosotros Natasha Fielding, de la agencia de mercados, de inteligencia de mercados Argus, y nos ha compartido que efectivamente el mercado de gas, los precios están bastante volátiles. Ahora mismo lo que va a marcar los precios a medio plazo sería el GNL, que está entrando en Europa, y que sobre todo después de este auge, de esta alza de precios del año pasado, los sectores de industriales que más fueron afectados por esta alza fueron el sector de la química y el sector de acero. Seguimos explorando en más detalles cómo está recuperando, cómo se ve desde este sector industrial y qué planes tienen. El impacto de la crisis energética es más visible si se mira de forma específica en los sectores industriales, en diferentes subsectores, porque no es lo mismo. Los cambios estructurales debido a mayores costes energéticos y planes de descarbonización pueden llevar a la inflación, al aumento de costes en diferentes industrias, sobre todo intensivas en energía. En el artículo de abril de 2023 de la consultora Boston Consulting se examina este eventual aumento. ¿Qué podría pasar en esta circunstancia? ¿Cómo podrían aumentarse los precios y el coste de energía en la industria? Y para evaluar las implicaciones se examinan 4 de los sectores más intensivos en energía de la economía alemana: el sector de la química, acero y materiales de construcción, y el sector automotriz. ¿Veis estas 4 en diferentes colores? Productos químicos, por ejemplo. En el medio plazo, muchos productos de químicos básicos, especialmente los derivados del gas natural, enfrentarán un cambio en su competitividad, amenaza de importaciones y reasignación de producción en el extranjero. Eso es básicamente lo que podría pasar con la industria química. Los precios esperados del gas natural también darán lugar a una diferencia de costes en el sector de producción de acero. Probablemente este sector va a tener que consumir más hidrógeno renovable, y rutas de producción con procesos más descarbonizados en lugar de gas natural. Esto podría ampliar aún más la desventaja de costes. En el sector de materiales de construcción, los elevados precios de la energía aumentarán el coste de los materiales de construcción per se. Y en la automoción, en toda la cadena de valor, se espera que los mayores costes de la energía aumenten el precio de un automóvil típico con motor de combustión interna. Aquí vemos cómo podría variar el porcentaje por tonelada de diferentes productos. Para las empresas que quieren seguir compitiendo en Europa y también en estos sectores en concreto, la transformación verde ha pasado de ser una oportunidad a un crecimiento, una necesidad estratégica. Varias empresas han manifestado ambiciosos objetivos de reducción de emisiones en la cadena de suministro. Existe una posibilidad de producir una serie de productos descarbonizados con menor huella de carbono, utilizando diferentes tecnologías, las energías renovables, entre otras. Las empresas siderúrgicas, en concreto, muestran una preocupación creciente por los costes de la electricidad, y así como los costes de gas natural, y por los niveles de capital necesarios para esta transición, para cambiar sus plantas hacia una fabricación neutra en carbono. Varios mercados también cuestionan el interés del consumidor por el acero verde y la capacidad de repercutir estos costes, este incremento de costes, a los clientes finales. La siderurgia necesita cantidades ingentes de energía. La energía constituye entre 20% y 40% del coste de producción de acero. Además, una acería consume mucha electricidad, la mayor parte de la cual todavía se genera con fuentes de energía que producen CO2. Fundamental para todo, desde automóviles y refrigeradores hasta puentes y ferrocarriles, el acero es responsable de 8% de las emisiones globales de CO2 y del 5% de las emisiones europeas. Por ejemplo, el vehículo promedio está compuesto por más del 50% de acero, lo que hace que el acero sea responsable de la mayor parte de la huella de carbono de este vehículo. Ante la creciente preocupación medioambiental, existe un interés en reducir las emisiones de carbono. Nos interesa conocer cómo reacciona uno de los sectores intensivos en energía frente a estos retos, que es el sector de acero. En Europa, el sector factura anualmente unos 130.000 millones de euros y emplea directamente a más de 300.000 personas, según la Asociación Sectorial de Acero en Europa, Eurofer. Hablamos con el representante de Eurofer en unos instantes para conocer de primera mano cómo respira este sector tan relevante para Europa, cómo respira hoy y cómo aborda los planes de la descarbonización. Well, I would like to introduce you now our next guest expert. Adolfo Aello is Deputy Director at Eurofer. Previously, he has been responsible for climate and energy since 2015. He leads advocacy and technical work on various dossiers in Eurofer, including the emission trading system, renewables, and energy efficiency. Adolfo brings 15 years of experience in these areas through his work with Brussels-based trade associations, and he holds an M&A in European Studies from the College of Europe, with a thesis focusing on EU trade policy. Adolfo, hello.
Good morning, and thank you for your invitation.
Adolfo, following the developments of the industrial sector in Europe after last winter's gas crisis and in the face of new energy and environmental challenges, we would like, with your help, to better understand the situation and the perspectives in the most relevant industrial sector, which is steel. And so my first question, what are the main consequences of last year's energy price increases for European steel industry, and how is the current situation?
The steel sector has been hit very severely by the energy crisis and economic downturn. According to our statistics, in 2023, Europe produced only 127 million tons of steel. This is roughly 7% than 2022. And most importantly, it's an historically low record. It's even lower than 2020, the COVID year, when Europe produced 132 million tons. Right now, the situation remains very uncertain. For 2024, we expect a moderate rebound by 5%. However, these figures are still very uncertain, since there are many elements that could jeopardize the rebound, such as inflation, bottlenecks in value chains, and the overall economic context.
The Vice President of Eurofer, Mr. Paul Voorde, commented just last year at one of the events that the steel sector is falling in Europe and that in the last 10 years, 20% of production has been lost and still imports are growing. To what extent would change in energy supply could reverse this trend?
Indeed, in the last 10 years, Europe lost roughly 30 million tons of steel capacity, half of it on the European market, half on the export market. Due to that, since 2016, Europe became a net importer of steel, while in the past it was a traditional net exporter of steel. The root cause of this is a toxic combination, on one side, of high energy and carbon costs in Europe, and on the other side, unfair trade practices by third countries. We do have a structural overcapacities in third countries by more than 600 million tons, which causes unfair trade like dumping and undermines the viability of the steel sector. On the energy side, we do have overcome, of course, the peak of the crisis in 2022. However, energy prices in Europe, in particular gas and electricity, remain higher than our competing countries. Therefore, in short term and medium term, we still expect difficulties for our companies.
And continuing with potential change in energy market, I would like to ask a question on the electricity market reform. According to Spanish Energy Minister Teresa Ribera during the Spanish presidency at the EU, she said that the implementation of the planned measures on electricity market reform will lead to the fact that consumers throughout the EU will benefit from much more stable energy prices with the PPAs, less dependence on fossil fuel prices, and a better protection just again against future crises. Will it be enough to support Europe's steel industry?
Well, we have a less positive assessment of the reform. Of course, we are out of the peak of the crisis, mainly due to the dynamics of the energy market, rather than for the impact of the reform. The reform was proposed in the context of emergency, therefore there was no impact assessment by the Commission, nor a comprehensive revision of the functioning of the electricity market. Actually, according to the European Commission itself, fossil fuels will continue setting the electricity prices in Europe by 2030 and beyond. Therefore, from our perspective, the wholesale electricity markets still have structural problems, which will have to be fixed with a more comprehensive reform, possibly by the new Commission. On the other side, where we do share a positive assessment is the PPAs, the power purchase agreement. There, indeed, the reform acknowledges the bottlenecks for energy-intensive industries like steel in accessing PPAs and tries to address such bottlenecks with regulatory interventions.
Another factor which probably could help or assist the industry demand, how do you see the growing role of government subsidies in industrial support, as it was the case of debates at the end of the 2023 in Germany, where several industries were asking for major subsidies? What's your view on it?
Government subsidies are the natural consequence of the lack of a comprehensive European policy in the field of energy, decarbonization, and funding. From the perspective of a European trade association, we expect and we call on funding support across all member states because European steel plays a role in employment in many regions, and it's very important that this is preserved all over Europe. At the same time, it's very clear that the decarbonization of the sector will require funding support. According to our estimates, roughly 30 billion euros of capital investments are required only by 2030. And while our companies are mobilizing their private investments, it's clear that they will require also funding, both at European and national level.
And of course, all that impacts a lot the competitiveness of final products, industrial products in Europe. And what levers are needed to improve the competitiveness of the steel business in Europe in the highly variable energy context, and also taking into account the strong competition from China and the US?
Well, so far what we see is the lack of a comprehensive European industrial policy, which needs to leverage different policies, in fact. First and outmost, energy. Access to affordable energy needs to be the priority of the entire EU. Secondly, we need a more assertive trade policy. We are still facing unfair trade practices, as I said before, dumping overcapacities in third countries. So there you need effective trade defense, possibly a global arrangement with the US as proposed by President Biden and President von der Leyen, and effective solutions for our global exports. Thirdly, you need some funding support for the decarbonization and the energy costs in Europe. And lastly, we need also demand-side measures to create incentives to consume greener steel in the future.
Precisely about the measures, carbon border adjustment mechanism for the introduction for the comprehension of everybody is the EU's tool to put a price on the carbon emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods that are entering the EU. And with this, the EU pretends to encourage clean industrial production in non-EU countries. And the gradual introduction of the CBAM is aligned with the phase-out of the allocation of free allowances under the EU emission trading system to support decarbonization of EU industry. And the steel also will be part of this CBAM measure mechanism. How the CBAM will affect international steelmakers from which the EU imports the steel, and how the international market is reacting to this mechanism.
As European steel sector, we have supported the introduction of the CBAM in the last years. However, right now, the assessment of the measure is still preliminary. In fact, the CBAM will not involve any payment by importers until 2026. Right now, importers only need to declare their emissions. So from our perspective, the impact of the measure will be depending on its design and its effectiveness. From this perspective in particular, we need effective measures and effective design of the CBAM on the import side, because we see a huge risk that importers will try to circumvent the measures, as they have been traditionally doing with trade defense instruments. And on the other side, it's very important to have a solution for tackling the competitiveness of our exports on global markets. Right now, the CBAM does not include a solution for the exports, but the Commission has been mandated by Parliament and Council to reassess the exports at the end of this year. And we expect that with this assessment, there should be a concrete proposal for preserving roughly 45 billion euros of European exports that are sold on the global markets.
And with all in all these factors, volatile gas market, environmental objectives to reduce the emissions, how is the steel industry adapting to decarbonization changes that are accelerating in the EU? And also, if you could please comment on the demand for green steel in this scenario of decarbonization.
Yes, in spite of this overall challenging context, our companies are the front runners of decarbonization worldwide. In Europe, we do have very ambitious 2050 targets, and now we will have very soon also 2040 targets. Our companies have been preparing very ambitious decarbonization projects. These are essentially addressing two pathways. One is carbon capture and usage and storage, and the second is hydrogen-based steelmaking. These two pathways will be viable in Europe, however, only if there is access to competitive energy, in particular electricity and hydrogen. According to our estimates, we will need to increase our electricity consumption by more than 4 compared to our current electricity purchases already by 2030. And that will be possible only if there is access to competitive energy. And secondly, if there is funding support for those projects that, as I mentioned, will cost more than 30 billion euros by 2030 only. So on our side, on our steel company side, there is a lot of technological innovation and a lot of projects which are ready by 2030 if supported by the right enabling conditions and can reduce emissions by roughly a third in less than 10 years. On the other side, on the demand side, we do see more attention from the market for greener steel in some value chains, in particular in the automotive. However, market-only response is insufficient to create the dynamics for these huge investments. So we are calling on institutions also to have regulatory interventions to create incentives for the demand side for greener steel in all the different value chains where steel is used, such as automotive, construction, renewables, and so on. So the answer is that our sector is ready for the transition, but it needs to be put in an overall context of enabling conditions for such huge investments.
Adolfo, thank you so much for sharing with us this Eurofairs vision and also your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, esto fue con nosotros Adolfo Aillo, que nos ha compartido la situación particular de la industria de acero, de cómo ellos están percibiendo este incremento de precios de gas, el mercado volátil, y qué esfuerzos se está haciendo en los planes de la descarbonización y de la reducción de emisiones. Bueno, hemos visto que los sectores industriales aún están golpeados por los precios energéticos y se están recuperando del incremento de precios. Y a lo largo de la historia, las recesiones y los cambios radicales también han demostrado ser caldos de cultivo para la innovación y la definición de la próxima normalidad. Como dijo una vez el economista de Stanford, Paul Romer, es terrible desperdiciar una crisis. Y esperamos que en los próximos meses y años ocurrirán ya algunos cambios frutos de la política industrial de la Unión Europea para fortalecer la competitividad y fomentar nuevas oportunidades. En Negocios TV seguiremos estos cambios energéticos que impactan la economía. Si tenéis preguntas o temas de curiosidad, compartirlos con nosotros debajo de los vídeos en el canal y luego los podemos abordar en los próximos programas. Os deseo muy buena energía y hasta pronto.